I never thought I would be the one to do it. Of all the humans on Galactic Concord Station, I was probably the least likely candidate for anything memorable. I was not a general. I was not a scientist with a wall of awards. I was Marcus Vale, a mid-level diplomatic engineer who fixed power relays and occasionally attended briefings that were so far above my clearance level that I spent most of them quietly studying the ceiling tiles. But life has a strange way of choosing its moments, and on the night of the annual Concord Symposium reception, it chose me. Let me give you some background, because context matters here. Humanity joined the Galactic Concord 6 years ago. 6 years sounds like a long time until you realize that some of the species on this station have been traveling between stars for 40,000 years. To them, we are newborns. We arrived loud, curious, a little reckless, and full of questions that nobody had thought to ask in centuries, simply because everyone had already agreed on the answers. The other species were polite about it, most of them. Commander Erith, my supervisor, a Kithan who looks like a refrigerator made of shell and poor moods, described humanity once as cosmically premature. I wrote it in my journal and underlined it. I thought it was kind of a compliment. The station itself is remarkable. It orbits a neutral star that belongs to no one species, which is exactly the point. 47 sapient species share its corridors, its meeting halls, its observation decks. The architecture had been built and rebuilt over thousands of years to accommodate bodies of wildly different sizes, atmospheres, and preferred temperatures. Walking through the main concourse felt like falling through a dream. You might pass a Dreth, beings of translucent blue who communicate through vibration, and then turn a corner and nearly collide with a Sorvine cluster, which is less an individual and more of a cooperative of small organisms that have chosen, through apparent democratic consensus, to operate as one creature. I stopped being surprised by things after the 3rd month. Mostly. The vel'shaan, however, were different. You could not stop being surprised by the vel'shaan. They were among the oldest spacefaring species in the Concord, with recorded history stretching back farther than most civilizations had even existed. They were tall, 7 feet at minimum, with 4 arms and bioluminescent skin that shifted color with their emotions the way a human face might flush or pale. Their hair moved slightly even in still air, as if underwater, and their eyes were a deep silver that seemed to catch light from sources that were not there. They were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. Every species on the station treated them with a particular kind of careful reverence. You did not approach a vel'shaan casually. You did not interrupt one. You certainly did not speak to one without a reason that could be formally documented and reviewed. Dr. Alindra Voss was the most prominent vel'shaan on the station, and possibly in that entire sector of the galaxy. She had won 3 galactic academic honors for her work in crystalline memory lattices, a field of research that I only vaguely understood, but which apparently had implications for long-term data preservation across deep space. She lectured. She published. She was recognized in every corridor she walked through, by every species, with quiet and respectful distance. Everyone knew her name. No one sat beside her at meals. I first noticed the gold in the archive hall, about 2 months after I had been assigned to reroute a fiber cable through the ceiling above the research wing. She was below me, speaking to a group of young researchers from 6 different species, and every single one of them was leaning forward slightly, the way living things do when something important is being said. I was watching from the scaffolding, probably longer than I should have been, when she looked up. Our eyes met. Her skin, which had been a calm pale blue, shifted briefly to a warm and unmistakable gold before she looked away and continued her lecture. I had no idea what that meant. I filed it in my mind, under things to look up later, and went back to the cable. Later became that same evening. I sat in my bunk with a datapad and spent 3 hours reading everything the station archive had on vel'shaan bioluminescence. It was, I discovered, their emotional language. Involuntary, uncontrollable. The color shifts were the equivalent of facial expressions, except that they could not be hidden or suppressed. Every feeling a vel'shaan had was, quite literally, visible. Gold, according to the archive, indicated curiosity combined with something deeper. The closest translation in any human language was interested attention of a personal nature. It was considered among the most private of the color states. Displaying it in public was uncommon. Displaying it in the direction of another person, in a way that that person could see, was considered, culturally, almost a declaration. I put the datapad down. I picked it up again. I kept reading. The vel'shaan did not pursue relationships the way most species did. Their courtship process involved a formal written petition, submitted to a cultural review committee, followed by institutional approval from the other party's primary research or diplomatic body, followed by a waiting period of no less than 14 of their home months. The first official meeting between two parties who had expressed mutual interest was conducted in the presence of senior scholars and recorded in the Cultural Archive as a historical event. No other species in the Concord had ever successfully initiated a romantic connection with a vel'shaan. The one notable attempt, by a well-meaning Dreth ambassador 2 centuries prior, had caused a diplomatic disruption that was still cited in intercultural training materials as an example of what not to do. I went to sleep telling myself this was not my problem. I woke up the next morning and immediately made it my problem. Over the following weeks I crossed paths with Alindra 4 more times. Each time was brief and professional. She once asked me a technical question about a broken terminal in the archive substation, and we stood side by side over the open panel for about 6 minutes, and her skin did the gold thing again. I did not say anything about it. I did not say anything at all except to explain what was wrong with the terminal and how I would fix it. But I noticed. I noticed everything. I started learning vel'shaan. Not the simplified trade dialect that most station staff used for basic communication, but the formal register, the one used in academic settings and personal addresses. I used archived recordings. I practiced at 0500 before my shift began, quietly, in the small human recreation room that nobody else used at that hour. It took 3 weeks to feel even marginally confident. The tonal structure of their language was unlike anything in the human linguistic family. There were sounds in it that my vocal cords were not designed to produce. I produced them anyway, badly at first, and then less badly, the way humans have always learned things that were not built for us. The night of the symposium reception came. Every species on the station had representatives in the grand hall. The hall itself was enormous and beautiful, a vaulted space with viewports along the far wall that looked out into open stars. The lighting shifted in slow cycles to accommodate different species' visual preferences. The sound was a constant, layered murmur in a dozen languages. I stood near the edge of the room in my dress uniform, which was clean and pressed and made me look, in this particular crowd, approximately as impressive as a paper boat at sea. I saw Alindra across the room. She was in the upper gallery, which was where the most senior delegates and researchers gathered. She was surrounded by people, a Chthon diplomat, 2 Sorvine observers, a small group of Dreth in their formal blue formations, and every one of them was attentive and respectful, and carefully positioned at a distance that communicated reverence. She was speaking, and they were listening, and her skin was the calm, steady blue of someone performing a social function with great competence, and no particular joy. I got a drink from the human table, something that tasted like carbonated fruit, and was strong enough to be interesting, and I stood there for a moment, and thought about the 14-month waiting period. I thought about the cultural committee. I thought about the Dreth ambassador, and the training materials. I thought about the gold. Then I thought, I am human. We have been doing things that were inadvisable, and also correct for 200,000 years. It is basically the only thing we have always been consistent about. I walked across the room. I was aware, as I moved through the crowd, that people were noticing. The Chthon parted slightly. The Dreth formations adjusted. By the time I reached the upper gallery and stopped in front of Alindra Voss, there was a particular quality of silence around us. Not the absence of noise from the rest of the room, but a focused stillness from the people immediately near us, who had all, apparently, understood what was happening before I said a word. Her 4 arms went still. Her skin held its blue for one long moment, the way a breath holds before it releases. I spoke in formal vel'shaan. My accent was not good. My grammar was careful, and probably slightly textbook, but the words were correct, and I said them clearly. Dr. Voss, I have been reading your work on crystalline memory lattices. I believe you are the most brilliant person on this station, and also the most interesting. I would consider it a great honor if you would have dinner with me, informally, as 2 people, if you are willing, rather than 2 species representatives. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then her skin changed. Gold, deep and warm and immediate. spreading from the center of her chest outward along all four arms and up her neck and face, brighter than anything I had found described in the archive, lighting the space between us, the way sunrise lights the edge of a cloud. It was the most honest thing I had ever seen another living being do. She looked at me for a moment. Then, in accented but careful English, she said, "I was beginning to think no one ever would." The next 2 days were, in the most technical sense, a diplomatic situation. Delegate Sorvan, her vel'shaan colleague, found me in a corridor the following morning and explained, with patience and something close to bewilderment, that I had bypassed 11 distinct courtship protocols. I listened. I nodded. I asked if Alindra was upset. He paused for a long moment. "She laughed when I brought it up," he said. "I have not heard her laugh in 4 years. Commander Urith called me into his office, which was always a mildly terrifying experience, because his office smelled like low tide, and he had the kind of stillness that large predatory things develop over a lifetime of patience. He looked at me with all 6 of his compound eyes and informed me that the vel'shaan Cultural Committee had sent a formal inquiry to the Human Diplomatic Office requesting an explanation for why no petition had been filed. "And?" I said. "And the Human Diplomatic Office," he said slowly, responded by saying, and I am reading the exact phrasing, "We were busy." He clicked his mandibles twice. "The committee has classified this response as refreshingly direct. This is the first time in 4,000 years they have used that phrase about anything." I did not say anything. He stared at me a while longer. "You are a deeply unusual mammal," he said finally. He said it in a way that I chose to interpret as respect. The dinner was on a Thursday, station time. We used a small table on the observation deck, the one on the north side where the viewport looks directly into open space, and the stars are close enough that you feel, for a moment, like you could reach out and hold one in your hand. I brought food from the human mess. She brought something from the vel'shaan commissary that was pale and geometric, and tasted, when I tried a small piece, like cold clean water, and something faintly sweet underneath. We made faces at each other's food. We laughed. She told me about her research. I told her about Nairobi, where I grew up, and about my mother who was an engineer, and who taught me that the best way to understand something complicated was to take it apart carefully and put it back together with full attention. I told her I took this posting because I wanted to see if the universe was as big as it looked from the ground. "It is," I said, "bigger." She told me that her people live for 400 years, and that she had spent 200 of hers being admired, and another 80 being formally addressed by people who wanted access to vel'shaan knowledge, vel'shaan influence, vel'shaan prestige. She had spent, she said quietly and without complaint, very little time simply talking with someone who wanted nothing except her company. Her skin was gold the entire evening, not bright and startled as it had been in the grand hall, but steady and warm, the way a fire settles when it has been going long enough to trust itself. I walked back to my bunk at 3 in the morning, past the long window in the residential corridor that faces west, toward open space. The stars outside were enormous, and still, and had been burning for longer than anything I could name. I thought about a theory I had read somewhere once, a human theory, written by a human philosopher who had never left Earth, which said that the universe bends toward connection, that all the distance between things is not emptiness, that it is just space waiting to be crossed. We have always been good at crossing space. That is the human thing, more than anything else. Not the ships, not the engineering, not even the stubbornness, though all of those matter. The real thing is simpler. It is the willingness to walk across a room towards someone who has been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to simply come over and say hello. 40,000 years of civilization had not done it. We managed it in 6. I think my mother would have understood. She always said the hardest part of any problem was deciding it was yours to solve. I had decided, and the stars outside the window burned on, quiet and steady and impossibly far, the way beautiful things always are, just before you realize they are close enough to reach.